By the time a fighter gets to the UFC, they've usually been competing in one way or another for well over a decade. They've had ups and downs, wins and losses, gone back to the drawing board many times. So even though the UFC may be on a grander scale than their previous fights, they're usually equipped to deal with the outcome of a fight, whatever way it goes. Most guys are more than capable of handling the pressure and performing well under the bright lights. They don't usually get overwhelmed by the magnitude of the occasion. Every once in a while, though, a fighter comes along who, by trash talking and psychological warfare, can turn the heat up, drag their opponent somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere they haven't been before, and ultimately make the fight about way more than just winning or losing. It can become about defending your camp, the validation of your martial art, or even about representing an entire fucking nation. Obviously, they're not experienced in dealing with that type of stress, and very few fighters are equipped to deal with the prospect of a loss under those circumstances. We've seen it many times over the years. Fighters bend, buckle, and break under the immense pressure of this type of wicked mind fuckery. One of the greatest examples of this in the UFC was Chael in the first Anderson fight. Chael was a great middleweight during his run, but for me, by far his most impressive attributes were outside the cage. He was the first MMA fighter I had seen who had the charisma and the balls to create a spectacle of that magnitude using just his mouth, but also possessed the incredible composure to not crack under that pressure himself. Say what you want about the guy, but Chael has two big brass balls hanging between his legs. They may not be working properly, but they're made out of fucking brass. He dragged Anderson around a vicious press tour by the scruff of the neck, and he made that fight about everything but the fucking fight. He insulted Anderson, mocked jiu-jitsu, trashed his coaches, and he repeatedly characterized Brazilians as a bunch of uncivilized, borderline savages. Anderson just could not handle it. There were times where he refused to address Chael, wouldn't give proper answers. He just collapsed under the pressure. I mean, I can understand why. This went from just another title defense to a situation where he had to defend the honor of every important thing in his life. He was defending himself, his family, jiu-jitsu, the Nogueira brothers. He went from the enviable position of a beloved Brazilian superstar to the terrible position of suddenly having to defend the honor of an entire nation on the grandest fucking scale. The man just imploded, and it was a huge factor in the fight. Chael made Anderson look like an amateur. He beat his ass, rocked him with his sloppy boxing, took him down, and molested him all over the octagon. But Anderson was just so good that even when he lost, he still fucking won. With 2 minutes left on the clock, he pulls a fucking rabbit out of a hat and taps Chael's ass out with a triangle. Anderson was just a born winner. It was like, good fight, Chael, nice try, but by the way, this. But Chael did get within 2 minutes of beating the greatest fighter in the world. And in my opinion, his biggest weapons were all psychological. The reason I'm bringing that up is because sometimes you'll be having a discussion about the psychological warfare and the buildup of a fight, and someone will jump in with, for fuck's sake, what is this, the Real Housewives of New Jersey? I don't need all the drama. I just want to watch him fight. Now, if you really don't give a shit about the buildup and just want to see the fight, I actually applaud you. But if you use that argument to kind of condescend, I'd have to disagree. Because not only is the buildup what gives the fight all of its context, but the psychological warfare is sometimes one of the biggest deciding factors in a fight. So whenever someone says that, I'm always the first to put my hand up and say guilty. I love the build-up. I mean, outside of being super intense and building hype, psychological warfare at its best can sometimes be almost as significant as any physical attributes the fighters are bringing into the octagon. Like, Chael had already inflicted huge damage on Anderson before they even got to the octagon. He had rocked his confidence and rattled his nerves. So when someone acts like a purist by saying they're above the drama, I get where they're coming from. But I feel like they're the ones who are missing out on a crucial element of the sport. The mind games and the dynamic that develops between opponents is a huge component of the contest and can have a massive impact on what transpires in the cage. It's as much a psychological battle as anything else. And of course, it's entertaining as fuck. Anyway, Chael was great, but he really only brought it to that level against Anderson. Conor kinda took that psychological game to another level. He decimated many opponents during his featherweight run. Now, you might think I'm overstating the importance of mind games, but think about this. Conor has made every single one of his opponents look almost foolish, destroyed them all, except for two, Nate Diaz and Chad Mendes. And what do those two have in common? They both took the Conor fight on very short notice. Chad took the fight on less than 2 weeks' notice, and although he got finished, he had a great first round and landed some serious shots. Nate took the fight on around 10 days' notice, went to war, wore Conor down, and tapped the fuck out of him inside too. So the only two opponents who have made Conor look in any way beatable both had incredibly short camps. Conor didn't have 12 weeks to fucking annihilate these guys' confidence. He didn't even really have 2 weeks because the opponents were so short notice that they were likely caught up in a last-minute scramble to get their shit together and probably didn't have a spare minute to dwell on the trash talk flying out of Conor's face. Now that could be a coincidence, but think about this. By far the greatest fighter Conor has ever faced is Jose Aldo, and nobody had a worse showing and did themselves less justice than Jose. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the best fighter who performed the worst is also a guy who went through not one, but 2 huge build-ups with McGregor. Jose spent 2 long years jetting around the globe, getting absolutely skull-fucked by a raving lunatic. Those press conferences were so vicious, they were almost hard to watch. They brought me back to schoolyard bullying. There was a press conference in Brazil where the crowd wanted to fucking lynch McGregor. They were chanting, "Ooh, vamos rey, you're gonna die." And not only did Conor not give a shit, but during the face-off, he started to chant along with the crowd, right into Aldo's face. "Ooh, vamos rey, you're gonna die." He turned the phrase around on Aldo, and Jose just looked like he could not cope. That was one of the many times where one of the baddest motherfuckers on the planet looked like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The net result of the whole thing was that by the time the fight rolled around, Jose was pretty much done. His walkout looked like a man on his way out to meet the executioner. His body language in the octagon was pretty much defeat personified. And we all know what happened next. Conor slept his ass before I had time to get the fucking cap off a bottle of beer. I was standing there like, for fuck's sake. It was a perfect, effortless, flawless fucking victory over one of the most formidable forces in MMA who was dead in the water long before the opening bell. Now obviously, I'm a fan of McGregor. I'm not the guy who doubted him every single time he faced a new style. But when you consider the circumstances of his ups and downs, I'll be honest, I did wonder if McGregor was even more reliant on his mind games than he was on his big left hand. My biggest question was never, can he beat a wrestler or is he on Aldo's level? My question has always been, what is actually beating these guys? The mixed martial artist or his fucking mouth? And that finally brings me to the main event, because the build-up for UFC 205 was very different from McGregor's other fights. I'm not too interested in how or why. I mean, it's possible that Conor had kind of lost his aura of invincibility in the 2 Nate fights, so maybe he wasn't in a position to fuck with Eddie's head. But it actually seemed to me that Conor didn't even try to use his usual intimidation. For whatever reason, he just seemed happy to forgo the intense psychological warfare for this fight. The dynamic between the two was on full display in the pre-fight press conference. Conor showed up late dressed like one of Tony Soprano's fucking girlfriends, and the press conference proceeded in the format of a Conor McGregor comedy show, where he honestly seemed more interested in hitting a few one-liners than he did in trying to fuck with Eddie's head. I mean, he was very funny, and the crowd absolutely gobbled it up. But it was actually Eddie who impressed me most in that press conference. He was phenomenally composed in the face of an intensely hostile crowd. There were 3 moments where Eddie demonstrated supreme confidence. The first came before McGregor even arrived, when a journalist asked him if he minded getting booed by the crowd. Eddie didn't give the usual bullshit response, "Oh, I'm just happy they showed up," or he didn't say, "Well, they're booing me now, but they'll be cheering me on Saturday." His response was, "I'm disappointed in the Irish that this is your representative." Now, I don't know how you could be disappointed with their representative, considering their representative is the biggest fighter in this sport, but I like the answer because it was confident. He didn't try to blow the crowd or win anyone over. I interpreted his response as, "I don't give a flying fuck about the booing. I'm here for one reason, and that's to smash the fuck out of Conor McGregor." But the biggest statement of Eddie's confidence came when he tried to tell the crowd what Conor's big announcement was. He said, "Conor's having 2 kids and his girlfriend's not having twins. You do the math." That was fucking vicious. I mean, we've all seen how close Conor is with his girlfriend. She even attends his training sessions. That was a bit of a low blow. Alvarez was so confident that in front of a hostile crowd, he went for the most inflammatory remark he could possibly muster. That was the most savage insult of the entire build-up. It wasn't the words of someone who had any fear in provoking McGregor. That wasn't a "I'm gonna beat your ass" type insult. That was a "I'll reach into your personal life and fuck that up because I'm not afraid of you and I have zero respect for you" type insult. The last big indication of how Eddie regarded Conor came from the embedded clip, where it showed Eddie immediately after the press conference. He was high as a kite. He was laughing, joking around, said Conor looked like Cruella de Vil. It looked like he thought Conor was an absolute fucking joke. Then it flicks to Conor, and he's laughing around and joking too. I just thought, this is gonna be good. This is gonna be our war. Finally, we're gonna see how Conor does against an elite opponent with a full camp who's not a completely broken man before the fight even starts. Well, we all know how that played out. Conor went in there and molly-whopped the fuck out of Eddie. Clinical performance. There was a couple of flurries in the first where Eddie would rush in throwing hands and there'd be a little chaos in the exchange. Eddie wades in, punches flying, and in an instant you'd see a surgical left hand slice through all the chaos and find Eddie's chin with pinpoint precision. Conor's precision punches versus Eddie's wild strikes, it looked like a bolt of lightning cutting through a fucking tornado. After the first couple of minutes, it became the exact fight Conor had predicted. It wasn't about who was gonna win, it was just a matter of how long can Eddie last. The fight was man versus boy, clinical performance. Now, I had mentioned I was gonna do a video on the fight, and I'm sure this isn't the video you expected. I mean, I barely even discussed the fight. But honestly, when you consider that Conor's best win was against a dead man and his struggles with short notice opponents, that was my big takeaway from 205. Yes, he made history. Yes, he's the first 2-weight world champion. But above all, Conor's annihilation of Eddie Alvarez was the biggest validation of Conor McGregor, the mixed martial artist, of his entire fucking career. No mind games needed.